Hello and welcome to the Voice of the People. I'm your host, Kenneth Myers Sr. I love enough to tell you the truth, and I respect enough to give you facts. This is Saturday afternoon. It's beginning to cool off a little bit, and I'm sitting on my porch, in the hood, of course, and just reflecting upon my life as it relates to current events that I'm experiencing now. I guess it's safe to say that I've been around a while. I was born in 1953 in a rural southern town in South Carolina. It goes by the name of Barnwell, South Carolina. During that particular time, my mother gave birth to me in an all-black hospital in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And the town of Barnwell is about 35 to 40 miles from that black hospital. And so we were very proud, and also we were in a very good position during the time in 1953 to have a all-black hospital. That was the time, if you can recall, segregation was a way of life, which was legal, sanctioned by the church, sanctioned by the government, state and federal and local. And black folks, we were. I was born into that. We were not. How should I put this? In 1953, I was fortunate to be live in a neighborhood where my grandfather lived across the street. My uncle lived behind me. He had a black dentist live beside us. We had a home of modest means. I remember my parents remodeling it as the best they could. But things were okay. You know, when you're born into something, you don't really compare it to anything. But I do remember that I had an uncle that had a farm, and we always had a garden. So we always had okra, fresh tomatoes, butter beans, spinach, rapes, mustard. Always had field peas. You know, all of our vegetables were out of the garden. I remember that most everybody had some chickens of some sort, and the family members and friends who lived, outside of town, we had pigs, goats, that type of thing. And folks grew watermelons. Peaches were abundant in the area. Scarpadines, plum, bullets, fig trees, pear trees. So food was not something that you gave a lot of. You were secure in that. Everybody was cooking, and so as I recall, I think I was in high school before I had my first encounter with fast food. For eating a cheeseburger out of a restaurant. So prior to that, everybody ate food that was cooked, and the culture that we had, they would prepare a meal for you, and you would eat what you were given. And if not, they would wait until you had an increased appetite. Then you would be more eager to consume it. But that was pretty good. I hear my parents and folks in the community and the church talk about segregation, oppression, and the KKK and law enforcement was something to be feared, because you have to remember, during that time we were not represented on law enforcement. We were not able to serve as jurors, General Sessions Court, very much like a lynching mob. with a little bit of formality to it. But I do recall working at an early age. I guess when you're about 4 or 5 years old, we always had chores around the house, had to rake the yards, do stuff like that. So a work ethic indirectly was placed, upon you, and all the kids did that. We thought it was abnormal if you didn't have chores to do. And so the kind of custom we had was, a lot of people, because of the era that it was in, any child that was unruly or unmanageable, there's a good probability they would get killed by the police or some white mob, or they would cause hardship for the family. So how could a child cause hardship? See, sometimes we forget the history and what was really happening now. What I remember, in a small town, we had a grocery store. There was no such thing as credit. There was no such thing as credit cards. So most of the black folks had come out of a culture of sharecropping out of the 20s and 30s and 40s. And sharecropping basically meant that you worked on some white man land, or if you owned your land, you bought supplies and they charged you so much for it. At the end of the year, whatever profit you made was eaten up into your expenses. And so it was like you could never get ahead. It was sharecropping is another form of slavery. And I used to hear my grandfather talk, and he would always say that debt, being in debt, was a form of slavery. And so my father was a unique person. He was a World War II veteran, and he had 5 or 6 brothers, and he was very personable. And back then, all the men had 2 or 3 jobs. I think my father worked as a courier or a chauffeur for Milliken Mills, and so. But his other job was he would help his brother farm watermelons. We had a little juke joint. Mother had a little restaurant. And my father used to sell fresh fish out of the back of his car. He would go to Augusta, Georgia, to this fish house every week, I think on a Thursday. And so I would ride around with my father, would sell fish out of the back of his car. So that, so when I grew up, every man had 2 or 3 jobs, so surviving and striving was just part of our custom. And all the men, it wasn't too much classism, because like in the 50s and the 60s, the only entrepreneurs in town was, we had an undertaker, you had somebody that owned a nightclub, and you had the barbershop. I had another uncle, my same uncle who farmed in the country. He owned the barbershops. In the black community, the owner always sits in the first chair. So I had an opportunity, and we had a black business district downtown. They call it the alley, and as a kid, I would shine shoes in my uncle's barbershop and listen to the men tell the war stories and talk about life and talk about the struggle. Interesting enough, during the late 50s and 60s, from my personal vantage point and what I saw, my father has 2 or 3 friends who were ministers, and they worked in the plant as well. So all the men worked, and most pastors, pastoring was a part-time job for them. Their main job was, where they fed their family was in the factory or on the farm, that kind of thing. But it wasn't a whole lot of talk about prosperity. It wasn't a whole lot of talk about theology. Most of the men I knew, they talked about being a decent man, being a good man. That basically meant taking care of your wife and your children and your household and doing the best you can under the circumstances that you found yourself. But most of the men that I around as a kid, they were strong men. They were decent men. It was a segregated town, of course. I had the privilege, because my father owned a juke joint, at an early age to learn how to shoot pool and to learn how to gamble. So starting very early, used to hang out at the juke joints in the pool hall, and I would always be around men talking, and I learned just the protocol about the hierarchy of respect and staying in your place based on your age. But I was a pretty good pool shooter, and so that came to be to my benefit as I got older. Because when I was in high school, working in the factory ain't no joke. Walking on the cement floor, trying to outwork a machine. The machine wins every time. And so that was an extreme motivator for me to want to leave that immediate environment and have a different kind of life. And what supplemented that desire was I used to go visit my aunt and uncle in Camden, South Carolina. I went to Atlantic City one summer, and my grandfather lived across. Used to take me to Columbia, South Carolina. And that experience that stands out to me is that I had never seen housing projects and apartments 2 or 3 stories high. And I found that so fascinating that those people could live together and not have a yard. See, I came from a rural South Carolina where everybody had a shack, but everybody had a yard. They had boundaries that were yours. And so I found that quite interesting. Which down in the rural area, though, growing up, all the young guys, men, we all were as rites of passage. I think it's about age 10. We would always work in the fields, watermelon fields, cantaloupe fields, okra fields. I mean, so we had a lot of physical jobs. And during that time, if my memory serves me correctly, all of the black men were into baseball. Okay, all I heard about was Jackie Robinson. So that was a sport that black men could play. We had the Negro Leagues, and so every small town had their own team. And those Saturdays and Sundays, everybody was playing baseball. So that was a source of entertainment and a source of hope. And everybody was into boxing, because a lot of black men were successful in boxing. So we would listen to the radio. And what I enjoyed a lot growing up was, because I lived in town, I could walk about 7 yards and it's to the nightclub or the juke joint, whatever you call it. And it was always interesting to hear the music and to see people just mingle and just try ways to cope with the position that we were in. See, black folks in America, from my experience since 1953, life has always been a struggle. Second-class citizenship has always been something to tolerate, nothing to celebrate. We've always had to hope and pray for the impossible. So church served as a great opportunity to talk loud, to sing, to tap, just to be among ourselves. That institution of church served a lot of purposes. And if I can recall, the church folks and the juke joint folks and the folks who didn't believe and the folks that believed, we were all together. We celebrated each other on a whole lot of levels. We had an extreme tolerance for one another. Your grandparents, great-grandparents, your parents, your young folks. There was a lot of role definition. Everybody kind of knew your place within the black community. We were trained as children. This is interesting as I reflect back. We were trained we knew who the enemy was the enemy was the system and white folks. So everybody was trained to lie to white folks because they were the enemy. And most black folks I know had a personality that we had in our community. We had another personality. We put on a mask when we went among white folks. Okay. And I remember, I guess I was like 6th or 7th grade. My father was a member of the NAACP, and I would always go to the NAACP meetings with my father. And there was never a lot of folks in the community that supported liberation on any level. There was a level of this is how it is, and it can't get no better. We don't deserve any better. And I think part of that was because we were exposed to the good and the bad and the ugly as it relates to leadership in the black community. And back then, most of our ministers were called. What does call mean? I mean, those who could talk and could dress up a little bit, they would entertain us, Because I remember, because I lived in a rural area, we only had church one Sunday a month. And most preachers, if they could dress pretty good and talk pretty good, they would put 4 churches together to have one church. I'm talking about salary-wise. So a pastor might go to church A on the first Sunday, church B on the second Sunday of the month, and church C on the third Sunday, and on the fourth Sunday, there's another church. So how that worked out was, if I went to church on the first Sunday, then the next 3 Sundays, we would just have Sunday schools. And so that made it possible for deacons and trustees really ran the church. And your pastor was just a hired, he was a speaker. But the deacons and the trustees ran the church. And most of the small churches were a cluster of 5 or 6 families, And so in small churches, families run the church. And then when there was a disagreement, then the families, they would, break up and start another church. So you can go to the rural area or the urban area in the black community, and there's an abundance of churches, because one church would break up, and churches just multiply. Because traditionally, it was a part-time job, and then the ones who were good, they would, it's kind of like the Chitlin circuit or the minor leagues, as they develop their skills and how to speak and how to judge the audience and how to motivate and how to provide comfort when there's death, to provide comfort when there's no hope, and just to provide a general sedative to our second class citizenship. And as I reflect back, it was always mostly women, not all women, but half of the women went to church, half didn't. And of the men, about 20% of the men went to church. The other 80%, did otherwise. But nobody would have a conversation about that, and it just was okay. It really didn't matter. We were all in the same boat. We all lived a life of pain, of discrimination. But we found a way, we scratched out a way to have a little hope. In the South, a lot of folks, their only hope was to move north, So I know in the 50s and the 60s, the way systemic racism worked and the control of the Chamber of Commerce and all the jobs, white men were in power. And so, anybody that had an opinion that was articulated, they became verbal, and they wanted to be a first-class citizenship. Most families would ship you off out of town to protect you from being murdered, lynched, shot down by the police, or wrongfully arrested and incarcerated. Or they had another mechanism of social control. If you thought that you were first-class citizenship, they would say that you were crazy, and then they had in the probate judge, they could always send you away to the crazy house. So you see things back then, very much like things are now, just a little more sophisticated. Now, as part of my story is, I went to a all-black school, and I think I went to school a year early in first grade because my aunt was a first grade teacher, and of course, gave me a little social capital, so they eased me into school a year early. So, and I went to, and back then they used to beat us in the hand. The principal was under control of the white Department of Education. Most of your principals back then were not educated. Then I had an aunt that she was what you call a jeans supervisor. And they used to go around the state in the rural area helping to educate just the principals. Most of the principals were male. You have to understand, even back in the 50s, you have racism, then you have sexism. And so I had an uncle who met a jeans supervisor, and she came from a kind of educated, well-to-do family in Camden, and so he would go to Hampton University every summer to get up to speed, and he became a principal, and had an all-black school called Diamonddale that went for us to sixth grade. But as years moved on, that's the history of public education in the South, in the rural area in the 50s. And I knew a lot of men that were educated, but still, because of systemic racism and this blatant discrimination, could not get a job no matter what their degree was. I remember with state government, as early as the 70s, a white male with a GED was considered equal to a black male with a PhD. How does that sound? That's right. A GED, white male with about 5 years experience, was considered equal to a black man with a PhD with 1 year experience. Now, a lot of that stuff kind of happens now in a lot of, around our country. The standard is so high just for opportunity for a black male or a black woman, and for a white male or white woman, because of systemic racism, because of classism, because of the kind of country we have, they can be inadequate, not up to speed, but their whiteness would be accepted. And they will undergird them with protections. And so they get a pass because of their whiteness. So that's the world through the eyes of a child in the 50s and the 60s. And then when I was in 7th grade, I think it was 1964, 65, because my parents were affiliated with NAACP, they had early immigration all around the state. And in 7th grade, I went to an all-white school. And that was different. My father took me to the principal's office that day and told the principal to, keep an eye out for me. But, I come from a strong neighborhood, a strong family. Had been exposed to the NAACP, had been exposed to work, had been around the joke joints. So I saw the world through the eyes of a 7th grader, but really I had adult eyes. So they put me in all-white school. They had a system of classism where the affluent whites, upper-class whites, would be in Section A, and they were filtered to other whites through the other section, B, C, and D, and the best white teachers was always with Section A. And so in essence, the all-white public schools in the rural South, they were educating about 30% of the white population, about 30%. And then because they had control of everything, and then they controlled the banking, all the skilled labor. So the white girls and boys who didn't have any aptitude for academic achievement, they would give them a position as supervisor over smart blacks. I'm going to repeat that. Whites of limited academic prowess, because of their whiteness, were always given supervisor position over smart blacks. So the smart blacks would do the job, and then the white person would be given power over them, power over whether they could keep the job or not. So you have, so that's the country we live in. I'm talking particularly now about what I know, which is rural South Carolina in a small town. And so I felt fairly safe in the all-white school in Section 8 because most of those kids were not angry. Their parents were affluent. They were the number one stakeholder in the community, so they didn't have no problem with a couple of blacks here or there. And but during that time as well, most of the whites that were not in the private school, in the public school, they began to develop through their churches private schools. So you had an exodus of white students from the public schools, but it was mostly the kind of middle class whites, but they weren't upper middle class whites because the upper middle class whites controlled the school. So their kids, had a free private school, which is Section 8. And so we went through that experience, and I played a little football, I played a little basketball. And because of my background in working in the watermelon field and all that, I was a pretty good athlete. And I was fortunate enough to have a coach in 7th grade, Colonel Hunsucker, a retired Air Force colonel, white male. And he taught us basketball as an art. And he taught us about the principles of basketball. It's kind of like teaching math. He taught us the angles, the defensive strategies, the offensive strategies, and that type of thing. And so I had a pretty good foundation. And by being an athlete and living in the black community, when the kids played, we didn't have any supervision. So when you don't have any supervision, the big boys, the older boys beat you down so bad. But if you survive that, you're pretty good. So through that process, by playing basketball with the older fellas, everybody knew that, hey, this one here is tough. So they toughened me up. And so I became tough. And I had a work ethic, and I developed some defensive skills and some offensive skills. So, by local terms, I was a pretty good basketball player. Then I had the fortune of going to Atlantic City. I think the summer between my 9th grade, freshman year in high school, and my sophomore year in high school, I went to Atlantic City for a summer on the boardwalk. And that's when I was exposed to quality basketball, street basketball, and urban basketball. And they had a YMCA, a black YMCA. And that is when I was able to compete and really see that on a lot of levels I was good. And I was a superb athlete. And with the urban basketball, you have to, if you're going to get some points, you got to go ahead and get them, They were not into team sports, passing, setting picks. How I was trained in junior high schools, I was trained, basketball was a team sport and that kind of thing. But when I got to urban basketball, and it was like, man, you got to get your own. You got to get your own rebound. You got to steal the ball yourself. If you could play good defense and get a steal, and if you got the ball, you couldn't give it up. When you got the ball on offense, you take that ball and you make a shot for yourself. And so you had a lot of practice on playing one-on-one. And so because I had been taught the fundamentals of angles and math, so I was able to incorporate that into an urban game. And when I was in Atlantic City, I think that was in the 60, maybe 68, 69, I saw a lot of basketball players from around the country, but they was from Norfolk State, and I used to watch the college guys play. And so I knew that the no-look pass that Magic Johnson, people talk about Magic Johnson, I knew that came from Earl the Pearl. So, Earl the Pearl, if you're a guard, Nate Archibald, Earl the Pearl, Earl the Pearl was, the first thing we've ever seen close to a Globetrotter, but in legalized basketball. So I was able to see a lot of the tricks of the trade that summer. So I came back my 10th grade year, and I had an exposure greater than most other players. Plus I was 6'1", and playing point guard. And back in the 60s, point one was kind of tall for a guard. Because even during high school, I had the white coaches always play me at forward. By being an athlete, it didn't really matter to me. I just loved the game so much. I would run around, get steals, get rebounds, make assists, shoot shots, block shots. No big deal. Then I had the fortune of the summer before my senior year, I went down to the Citadel to a basketball camp. And I made the all-star team as a point guard. So when I came back my senior year, that's when they fully integrated the schools. And my first exposure with learning about booster clubs and special interest group and the power of parents. And also, we had a tradition in our high school to play Dixie at the Pat Rally. So, that summer when I became an all-star point guard at the Citadel, and they offered me, it's a scholarship, my self-worth kind of magnified itself. So I knew that I had some leverage. So I refused to participate in a pep rally playing of Dixie, and I walked out, and most of the black students is followed me. And so I guess I was labeled as a renegade. And then we had a new basketball coach for the high school, and we had our first basketball meeting. He told me that I would be playing, forward, and I told him that I just made all-star team as a point guard at the Citadel that summer, that I'll be playing point guard. And his response to me was, if you play at all, son, boy, whatever, you'll be playing what I tell you to. And my response was, if I play at all, it'll be point guard. And he told me, but you off the team, get out. So he kicked me off the team, so I left the team, But several days later, the principal brought me back to the basketball practice and told the coach in front of the whole team that I was his point guard. So I guess I won that battle, and I had a pretty good year in high school. I guess I averaged triple-double the whole season. I was kind of like the Westbrook. I played that style. I think I was a little more smoother than that. But anyway, I got arrested 2 or 3 times just for demonstrating. Obviously, the white coach blackballed me, that type of thing. So it was my intent to go to the service after I graduated from high school, because I knew I was going to leave that town. But they had a coach from the black school that came over there, Donald Kidd. He was a Kappa, and he knew about HBCUs. So he told me and 2 other fellows to go down to Talladega College on the weekend for a tryout on the basketball team. So we went down there, and they brought the college team out one Saturday morning. We scrimmaged. And after about 10 minutes, the coach, pulled me aside and told me that I had a full ride to Talladega College to play basketball. And full ride meant, financial aid or whatever it took. It's a financial education. So I was able to escape small town segregation and systemic racism, and I was able to go to Talladega College in Alabama, all black HBCU. And it was during that experience that I was able to heal. I really didn't know how much emotional trauma that I had been subjected to, or the impact it had had upon me. But when I got in that all-black environment, I had a cafeteria, and black folks with PhDs. I had never been around black middle-class kids, and everybody just seemed so happy and just so normal, So that was my first time experiencing peace, safety, and security. So, I had a pretty good time. I had a little social capital because I played basketball. In high school, because I was isolated and emotionally traumatized, I did a lot of reading and I did a lot of time management. And I was able to live within myself. I didn't need any praise. I didn't need any acceptance. I didn't need to be validated. I was self-contained. And so, I did pretty good in my schoolwork because I had discipline enough to study, to read, and time management. And so that's how I escaped poverty, systemic racism, in a small town in South Carolina, rural, down near the Savannah River plant, where the joke is you either die from radiation or starvation. But I just had to tell a little bit of my story. Sometimes you have to look back where you come from. And so I've always considered myself fortunate to have a father, to have a grandfather, to have an uncle, to have a small community where there's tolerance and everybody emphasized your strength and they just tolerated your weaknesses. And so we were able to nurture one another. And I was able to escape poverty. And that's part of my story from 1953 to 1975. I'm your host, Kenneth Myers Sr. I love enough to tell you the truth, and I respect enough to give you the facts.